The Wyoming territory stretched endlessly under a canvas of amber and crimson as the sun crested the distant mountains. At the Double Eagle Ranch, the largest spread in 3 counties, dawn meant the same ritual it had for 27 years. Annie Martinez wiping down her hands on her worn leather apron and stepping into the stables before the roosters had finished their morning call. Ethan Caldwell stood on the wraparound porch of the main house, coffee steaming in his hands, watching the silhouette move between the stalls. Even from a distance, he could see her methodical precision. The way she checked each horse, ran her hands along their flanks, whispered words he couldn't hear, but somehow knew were gentle. It was the same every morning, yet he'd never really seen her until recently. "Morning, boss," came Tom's gravelly voice as the foreman climbed the porch steps, his spurs jingling against the worn wood. "Your father's asking for you in the study." Ethan's jaw tightened. At 68, Marcus Caldwell was still the undisputed king of the Double Eagle, though the coughing fits that racked his frame told a different story. The consumption had been eating at him for months, turning the once imposing rancher into a shadow of himself. "Did he say what about?" Ethan asked, not taking his eyes off the stables. "Just said it was important. Real important." Inside the study, Marcus sat hunched over his mahogany desk, papers scattered before him like fallen leaves. The room smelled of leather, tobacco, and something else, something final that Ethan didn't want to acknowledge. "Son, sit down." Marcus's voice carried the weight of unspoken words. "We need to talk about what happens when I'm gone." "You're not going anywhere, Pa." The words felt hollow even as Ethan spoke them. Marcus chuckled, a sound that dissolved into a harsh cough. "Boy, I've been running this ranch since before you were born. I know when a beast is dying, and this old beast doesn't have much time left." He gestured to the papers. "I've been working on my will with Henderson in town, making sure everything's in order." Ethan shifted in the leather chair, its familiar creaks a comfort against the growing unease in his chest. "The ranch has been in our family for 3 generations. I know my responsibilities." "Do you?" Marcus's pale blue eyes studied his son intently. "Do you know every person who's bled for this land, every sacrifice that's been made?" Before Ethan could respond, a gentle knock interrupted them. Annie appeared in the doorway, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, a few rebellious strands framing her sun-weathered face. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Bella's showing signs of distress. I think the foal might be coming early." Marcus's expression softened in a way Ethan rarely saw. "What's your assessment, Annie?" "She's pacing, sweating more than usual. The foal's not due for another week, but sometimes they have their own timeline." Annie's voice carried quiet confidence. "I can handle it, but I wanted you to know." "Keep me informed," Marcus said. "And Annie, thank you." After she left, Ethan found himself staring at the empty doorway. "How long has she been with us?" "Annie." Marcus's tone carried something Ethan couldn't identify. "Longer than you might think. Her mother, Rosa, worked here when you were just a boy. Annie grew up on this land. I barely remember her as a kid. You were busy with school, then college back east. Different worlds." Marcus reached for a glass of water, his hand trembling slightly. "But she never left. Rain or shine, sickness or health, she's been here." Through the window, they could see Annie leading the pregnant mare from the stable, her movements gentle but decisive. She wore the same faded blue shirt and worn leather chaps she'd worn every day for years, practical clothes for practical work. Nothing about her suggested she was anything more than what she appeared. A dedicated ranch hand who knew horses better than most men knew their own names. "Why are you telling me this?" Ethan asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the desk. "Because when a man's time comes, he realizes what really matters. And sometimes, what really matters isn't what you thought it was." That evening, as the ranch settled into its familiar rhythm of night sounds, cattle lowing in the distance, horses nickering softly, the eternal whisper of wind through grass, Ethan found himself walking toward the stables. Annie was there, as he'd somehow known she would be, sitting on a hay bale beside Bella's stall. "How's she doing?" he asked, genuinely curious. Annie looked up, surprise flickering across her features. In all the years she'd worked here, the boss's son had rarely spoken to her directly. "Better. False alarm, I think. Sometimes they just need to know someone's watching." Ethan leaned against the stall door, studying the mare. "You have a way with them. Animals are honest. They don't pretend to be something they're not." Annie's dark eyes met his briefly before returning to the horse. "They respond to authenticity, and people don't." A sad smile touched Annie's lips. "People are more complicated. They see what they expect to see, not necessarily what's there." Something in her tone made Ethan look at her more carefully. In the lamplight, her face held a quiet dignity that spoke of strength tested by time and circumstances. Her hands, rough from work but gentle with the animals, moved with practiced confidence. There was something about her, a depth that he'd never bothered to notice. "I should get back," he said finally, though he wasn't sure why he was reluctant to leave. "Good night, Mr. Caldwell." As he walked back to the main house, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just had his first real conversation with Annie Martinez, despite her having worked on his family's ranch for years. The realization settled uncomfortably in his chest, mixing with the growing certainty that his father's condition was worse than anyone wanted to admit. Above them, the vast Wyoming sky spread its blanket of stars, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out below, yet somehow bearing witness to the moment when one man began to see past the surface of his carefully ordered world. 3 weeks later, the consumption finally claimed Marcus Caldwell on a Tuesday morning when the autumn wind carried the scent of early snow. Annie was the one who found him, slumped over his desk in the study, his fingers still gripping the pen he'd been using to write in his leather-bound journal. The funeral preparations consumed the following days like a wildfire consuming dry grass. The Double Eagle Ranch, which had always been a place of purpose and routine, suddenly became a hub of activity, as relatives, business associates and neighboring ranchers arrived to pay their respects to one of the territory's most respected men. Ethan moved through it all in a haze of responsibility and grief. There were arrangements to make, telegrams to send, and dozens of people to greet, many of whom he hadn't seen in years. His Uncle William arrived from Denver with his wife and 2 sons, their fine Eastern clothes and soft hands marking them as outsiders to ranch life. Cousins he barely remembered emerged from distant corners of the territory, their condolences mixed with barely concealed curiosity about their prospects for inheritance. Through it all, Annie continued her work with quiet efficiency. She tended the horses, managed the daily routines that kept the ranch functioning, and somehow appeared wherever she was needed without being asked. When Ethan's aunt fainted from the heat during the viewing, Annie was there with cool water and a steady hand. When the visiting horses grew restless in unfamiliar surroundings, she calmed them with her gentle touch and soft words. "That girl's been a godsend," remarked Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, as she watched Annie help an elderly rancher down from his carriage. "Marcus always said she had a special touch with everything on this ranch." Ethan nodded absently, his attention divided between greeting mourners and the growing weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The Double Eagle was his now, all 15,000 acres, the prize-winning cattle herd, the main house with its memories carved into every beam and board. It was everything he'd expected to inherit, everything he'd been raised to manage. The funeral itself was held on a Thursday afternoon under a sky so clear it seemed almost cruel. The entire community turned out, ranchers and shopkeepers, cowboys and town officials, even the territorial governor sent a representative. Marcus Caldwell had been more than a successful rancher. He'd been a pillar of the developing West, a man whose word was his bond and whose handshake was better than most contracts. Reverend Patterson's eulogy painted the picture of a man who'd carved a life from unforgiving land through determination, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to those who depended on him. As the words washed over the gathered crowd, Ethan found his gaze drifting to Annie, who stood apart from the family section with the other ranch hands. She wore a simple black dress that he'd never seen before, her usually practical appearance softened by the somber occasion. Tears tracked silently down her cheeks as she listened to the Reverend speak about Marcus's legacy, her grief genuine and deep. It struck Ethan that she might have known his father better than he did. Certainly she'd spent more time with him in recent years, working alongside him daily, while Ethan had been occupied with the business aspects of ranch management. After the burial, the crowd gathered at the main house for the traditional meal. Annie had somehow managed to coordinate with the local women to ensure there was enough food for everyone, despite the chaos of the previous days. She moved through the kitchen and dining room like a graceful shadow, refilling coffee cups, cutting pie, and making sure the visiting elderly folks had comfortable chairs. "She's quite remarkable," commented Judge Morrison, Marcus's longtime friend and legal advisor. "Your father often spoke of her dedication to the ranch." She's been a good worker," Ethan replied, though the words felt inadequate somehow. "More than that, I'd say." The judge's shrewd eyes studied Ethan carefully. "But I suppose you'll discover that soon enough." Before Ethan could ask what he meant, Uncle William approached with his practiced politician's smile and a firm handshake. "Ethan, my boy, I want you to know that if you need any help managing the transition, I'd be happy to assist. Running a spread this size is no small task. I've been working alongside Pa for years," Ethan said, his tone cooler than he'd intended. "I understand the operation." Of course, but there are financial considerations, legal matters. Sometimes an outside perspective can be valuable." William's eyes swept over the crowded room with obvious calculation. "A place like this represents significant value. With the right management, the right investments, the Double Eagle isn't for sale," Ethan said firmly. William's smile never wavered. "Naturally, I'm simply saying that keeping your options open is wise. The West is changing, nephew. The old ways of doing things might not be sufficient for the future." That evening, after the last visitors had departed and the house had settled into its new, strange quiet, Ethan sat in his father's study, his study now, surrounded by the detritus of the day. Empty coffee cups, forgotten plates, and the lingering scent of too many people in spaces accustomed to solitude. A soft knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Annie stood in the doorway, her black dress replaced by her usual work clothes, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. "Thought you might need this," she said, setting the cup on the desk. "It's been a long day." "Thank you." Ethan wrapped his hands around the cup, grateful for its warmth. "I don't know how you managed everything today. The food, the arrangements. I should have been more help. You had enough to deal with." Annie's voice carried a gentle understanding. "Grief takes its own time and space." And they stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of loss settling between them like a familiar presence. Finally, Annie spoke again. "Your father was a good man, fair and honest. He cared about this place and everyone on it." "He did." Ethan's voice was rougher than he'd expected. "I just hope I can live up to what he built here." Something flickered across Annie's expression, a look he couldn't quite interpret. "He believed you would. He talked about you often, about how proud he was of the man you'd become." "Did he?" The question came out more vulnerable than Ethan had intended. "Yes. He also said that sometimes the most important lessons come when we're not expecting them." Annie moved toward the door, then paused. "He left some things for you in his room. Personal things, might be worth looking through when you're ready." After she left, Ethan remained in the study, staring at the papers scattered across his father's desk. Tomorrow, Judge Morrison would return to read the will officially, and then the final chapter of Marcus Caldwell's life would be closed. The Double Eagle Ranch would officially pass to his son, along with all the responsibilities and expectations that came with it. But tonight, in the settling quiet of the house where he'd grown up, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there were things about his father, about the ranch, about Annie, about his own future, that he didn't understand. The certainty he'd always felt about his place in the world seemed suddenly less solid, like ground that might shift beneath his feet if he wasn't careful where he stepped. Outside, the Wyoming wind whispered through the grass with secrets it had carried for generations, and Annie Martinez walked quietly to her small cabin, carrying her own burden of knowledge and waiting for tomorrow to change everything. Judge Morrison arrived at precisely 10 o'clock the following morning, his black carriage cutting a sharp silhouette against the pale autumn sky. He carried himself with the dignity of a man who'd overseen the legal affairs of the territory's most prominent families for 3 decades. His silver hair and measured movements commanding respect, even in the informal setting of the ranch. The main parlor had been arranged with chairs for the expected attendees. Ethan, of course, along with Uncle William and his family, 2 cousins who'd made the journey from as far as Kansas, and Tom Brennan, the longtime foreman whose loyalty to the Caldwell family was legendary. Annie had been asked to attend as well, presumably because of her years of service and the possibility of a small bequest acknowledging her dedication. She sat near the back, her hands folded carefully in her lap, wearing the same simple dress she'd worn to the funeral. Her presence seemed almost incidental to the gathered family members, who spoke in hushed tones about cattle prices, land values, and the challenges of maintaining such a large operation in an increasingly uncertain economic climate. Judge Morrison spread his papers across the mahogany coffee table with ceremonial precision, his movements deliberate and grave. The leather portfolio containing Marcus Caldwell's last will and testament had been sealed since the day after his death, waiting for this moment when his final wishes would be revealed to those whose lives would be most affected by them. "Before we begin," the judge said, his voice carrying easily through the quiet room, "I want to acknowledge that Marcus Caldwell was not only a client, but a friend. He approached the drafting of this will with the same thoughtfulness and integrity he brought to every aspect of his life. What you're about to hear represents his careful consideration of what was best for this ranch, this family, and everyone who has contributed to the Double Eagle's success." Ethan shifted in his chair, his confidence wavering slightly. Something in the judge's tone suggested that the proceedings might not be as straightforward as he'd anticipated. "The will was updated 6 months ago," Judge Morrison continued. "After considerable deliberation and consultation, Marcus asked me to emphasize that every decision reflected his deep love for this land and his determination to see it continue to thrive for generations to come." Uncle William leaned forward slightly, his calculating eyes fixed on the judge. "Perhaps we could proceed with the reading. I'm sure Ethan is eager to understand his new responsibilities." "Of course." Judge Morrison lifted the first document, his voice taking on the formal cadence reserved for legal proceedings. "I, Marcus James Caldwell, being of sound mind and body, do hereby set forth my last will and testament." The initial provisions were standard: small bequests to longtime employees, donations to the local church and school, personal effects distributed among family members. Tom Brennan would receive a section of grazing land and a comfortable pension. Various cousins received modest cash payments that acknowledged their relationship while making clear they had no claim to the ranch itself. Ethan felt his shoulders relax as the reading progressed along expected lines. Then Judge Morrison's voice took on a different tone. "To my son, Ethan Marcus Caldwell, I leave the main house and all furnishings therein, along with the responsibility to maintain the family legacy with honor and integrity." A murmur of satisfaction rippled through the room. This was what everyone had expected, the logical continuation of 3 generations of Caldwell ownership. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. However, the majority of the Double Eagle Ranch, including 11,000 acres of prime grazing land, the main cattle herd, the breeding program, and all water rights, I leave to Ana Rosa Martinez, who has served this land with dedication and wisdom beyond her years, and who understands better than anyone what it means to be a true steward of this place. Doubt! The silence that followed was so complete that the ticking of the mantle clock sounded like thunder. Ethan felt the words register without fully comprehending them, as if he'd been struck by lightning, and his mind was still catching up to the reality of what had happened. Annie sat frozen in her chair, her face pale with shock. Her hands trembled slightly as the full meaning of the judge's words settled over her like a heavy blanket. Uncle William was the first to find his voice. There must be some mistake. That girl is just a ranch hand. She couldn't possibly— There is no mistake, Judge Morrison said firmly. The will is properly witnessed and legally binding. Marcus was very specific about his intentions. But why? Ethan's voice cracked as he finally managed to speak. Why would he do this? Judge Morrison reached for another document. He anticipated this question. There's a letter he asked me to read aloud. With deliberate care, he unfolded a sheet of paper covered in Marcus Caldwell's distinctive handwriting. To my family and friends gathered for this reading, I know my decision will come as a shock, but I ask you to hear my reasoning before you judge. For 23 years, Ana Martinez has been the heart and soul of the Double Eagle Ranch. She knows every acre of this land, every animal in our care, every challenge we face with the changing seasons. She has worked through blizzards and droughts, through good years and lean ones, never asking for recognition or reward beyond the satisfaction of a job well done. More importantly, she understands what many successful ranchers forget, that the land doesn't belong to us. We belong to it. We are its temporary guardians, responsible for passing it on in better condition than we found it. Annie has that understanding in her bones. She sees the ranch not as property to be exploited, but as a living system to be nurtured and protected. To my son, Ethan, I want you to know that this decision reflects no lack of faith in your abilities or character. You have been raised to be a leader, and I believe you will be a good one. But leadership without wisdom is dangerous, and wisdom without humility is destructive. I hope that in time you will come to understand that the greatest leaders are often those who never sought power, but accepted responsibility when it was thrust upon them. I'm asking both of you, Ethan and Annie, to find a way to work together. The ranch needs both of your strengths. Ethan, you understand the business side, the connections with buyers and suppliers, the financial management that keeps operations profitable. Annie, you understand the land itself, the animals, the delicate balance that makes it all possible. If you can find a way to combine your knowledge and skills, the Double Eagle will not just survive the challenges ahead, it will thrive. If you cannot find common ground, then I fear I have failed you both, and the legacy we've built here will crumble within a generation. The letter continued with specific instructions about the management structure, but Ethan barely heard them. His mind was reeling, trying to process not just the legal reality of what had happened, but the emotional devastation of discovering that his father had trusted a ranch hand more than his own son. Annie finally stood, her movement drawing every eye in the room. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely above a whisper. I can't accept this. It's not right. This ranch belongs to the Caldwell family. According to the law, Judge Morrison said gently, it now belongs to you. What you choose to do with that ownership is your decision. Uncle William rose abruptly, his face flushed with anger. This is preposterous. We'll contest this will. No court in the territory would uphold such an arrangement. You're welcome to try, the judge replied calmly. But I can assure you that Marcus was very thorough in his preparation. The will is unassailable from a legal standpoint. As the family members erupted into heated discussion about lawyers and legal challenges, Ethan found himself staring at Annie. She looked as stunned as he felt, her dark eyes wide with disbelief and something that might have been fear. In the space of 10 minutes, everything he'd believed about his life, his future and his place in the world had been shattered. The Double Eagle Ranch, his birthright, his inheritance, his identity, now belonged to a woman he'd barely noticed until a few weeks ago. But as he watched Annie struggle to comprehend the magnitude of what had been placed on her shoulders, Ethan realized that his own shock and resentment might be the least important thing in the room. Whatever his father's reasons, whatever his own feelings about the situation, the woman sitting across from him was now responsible for 15,000 acres of unforgiving land and the livelihood of everyone who depended on it. The question that would determine everything going forward was simple, even if the answer wasn't. What were they going to do now? The parlor emptied quickly once the shock wore off and the anger set in. Uncle William stormed out with his family in tow, muttering darkly about contested wills and family honor. The cousins followed with barely concealed disappointment, their dreams of windfall inheritance evaporating like morning dew under a harsh sun. Tom Brennan lingered only long enough to tip his hat to Annie and mutter, "Miss, if you need anything at all, you just let me know," before disappearing back to the familiar comfort of the stables. Within an hour, only Ethan and Annie remained in the main house, standing in the sudden silence like survivors of a natural disaster, surveying the wreckage of their previously ordered lives. Ethan paced the length of the parlor, his boots echoing against the hardwood floors his grandfather had laid with his own hands. His mind raced through a kaleidoscope of emotions, betrayal, confusion, anger, and underneath it all, a growing sense of panic about his future. 27 years, he said finally, his voice tight with controlled fury. 27 years I've been preparing to run this ranch. Every decision I've made, every plan I've had for my life, centered around inheriting the Double Eagle, and he gives it to... He stopped himself before saying something he might regret. Annie stood perfectly still near the window, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles were white. "To a ranch hand," she finished quietly. "You can say it. That's what I am. That's not what I meant. Isn't it?" Annie turned to face him, and Ethan was surprised to see not gratitude or excitement in her expression, but something closer to anguish. "Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I ever imagined—" She gestured helplessly at the room around them. "I can't even read half the legal words in that will. How am I supposed to run a ranch?" The admission hung between them, like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Ethan stopped pacing, studying Annie's face more carefully than he ever had before. Her distress seemed genuine, her overwhelm authentic. She wasn't celebrating her good fortune, she was drowning in it. "You can read, though," he said, realizing how little he actually knew about her background. "Some. Enough to get by. Your father taught me what he could over the years, but he focused more on the practical side of things. How to judge cattle, how to read the weather, how to manage the breeding schedules." Annie's voice grew stronger as she talked about familiar territory. "But the business side, the contracts and negotiations and financial planning, that's all foreign to me." "Then why?" Ethan slumped into one of the leather chairs his father had favored. "Why would he do this to both of us?" Annie was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. "He talked to me sometimes, especially toward the end. About the ranch, about what he'd learned in 40 years of ranching. He said the biggest mistake most ranchers make is thinking the land belongs to them instead of understanding that they belong to the land." That sounds like something he'd say. Despite his anger, Ethan felt a pang of loss at the familiar philosophy. He also said that the ranching business was changing, that the old ways of doing things, treating land like something to be conquered instead of partnered with, wouldn't work much longer. Annie moved away from the window, settling carefully on the edge of a chair across from Ethan. He was worried about what would happen to places like this if people didn't start thinking differently. "And he thought you thought differently?" I think he thought I understood something you hadn't learned yet." Annie's directness surprised him. Not because you're not capable, but because you've never had to see the ranch from the bottom up. You've always known it would be yours someday. I've had to earn my place here every single day. The honesty of her words cut deeper than any accusation could have. Ethan found himself remembering conversations with his father over the years, discussions about expansion, about increasing profits, about modernizing operations. Had there been warnings embedded in those conversations that he'd missed? Gentle attempts to redirect his thinking that he'd dismissed as the cautious ramblings of an older generation. "So what do we do now?" he asked finally. "I don't know." Annie's admission was barely audible. "Part of me wants to sign everything back over to you and go back to cleaning stalls. This is too big, too important. I could ruin everything." "You could," Ethan agreed, then immediately regretted his bluntness when he saw her flinch. "But so could I. The truth is, I know the business side of ranching, but I don't know the land the way you do. I've been so focused on profit margins and expansion plans that I've barely spent time in the fields or with the cattle in years." They sat in silence as the weight of their situation settled around them. Outside, the ranch continued its daily rhythms. Cattle needed tending, horses needed exercise, fences needed mending. The land didn't care about their personal crisis. It demanded the same attention and care it had always required. "Your father's letter mentioned working together," Annie said eventually. "What do you think he meant by that?" Ethan had been wondering the same thing. "Maybe he thought if we combined what we each know, we'd be stronger than either of us alone. Like a partnership? Something like that." Ethan studied Annie's face, trying to read her expression. "Would you be willing to try? At least until we figure out if it could work." Annie was quiet for so long that Ethan began to think she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a determination he hadn't heard before. "I loved your father like he was my own family. This ranch has been my home for more than 20 years. If there's a chance we can honor what he built here, then yes, I'm willing to try. Even if it means working with someone who spent years barely acknowledging your existence." Even then, Annie met his gaze directly. "But I'll need you to teach me the things I don't know. The business side, the paperwork, the negotiations with buyers. I can't learn all of that overnight. And I'll need you to teach me about the land, about the things my father tried to tell me that I was too stubborn or too busy to hear." They shook hands formally, the gesture feeling both awkward and momentous. It was the beginning of something neither of them could fully envision, a partnership born of necessity and grief, but perhaps containing the seeds of something more substantial. As Annie prepared to leave, she paused at the door of the parlor. "There's something else your father wanted you to have." He left a trunk in his bedroom with letters and journals dating back to when he first started the ranch. He said they might help you understand his thinking. After she left, Ethan climbed the stairs to his father's room, which he'd been avoiding since the funeral. The space still smelled like Marcus Caldwell, leather and tobacco, and the faint scent of the liniment he'd used for his arthritis. The trunk sat at the foot of the bed, its brass corners gleaming in the afternoon light, filtering through the lace curtains his mother had hung 20 years ago. Inside, he found exactly what Annie had described. Dozens of letters, journals filled with his father's careful handwriting, and photographs documenting the ranch's evolution over 4 decades. But on top of everything else was a sealed envelope with his name written in his father's familiar script. The letter inside was brief, but devastating in its clarity. "Son, if you're reading this, then you know about my decision regarding the ranch. I know you're angry, and I know you feel betrayed. Those are natural responses, and I don't expect you to understand immediately why I've done what I've done. But I need you to know that everything I've ever done has been motivated by love, for you, for this land, and for the future we're all creating together. The Double Eagle Ranch will face challenges in the coming years that will require more than business acumen to overcome. It will require wisdom, humility, and a deep understanding of what it means to be a steward rather than an owner. Annie has that understanding. You have the education and connections to navigate the changing world of ranching. Together, you might build something stronger than either of you could create alone. I'm not asking you to like this situation. I'm asking you to be the man I raised you to be, one who rises to meet challenges instead of being defeated by them. The choice, as always, is yours. As evening settled over the ranch, Ethan sat in his father's chair, surrounded by the documentary evidence of 4 decades of careful stewardship. Outside, he could see the lights in Annie's cabin, and he wondered if she was having as much trouble sleeping as he suspected he would. Tomorrow would bring the first day of their unlikely partnership, and with it, the first real test of whether Marcus Caldwell's final gamble had been the wisdom of a visionary or the folly of a dying man. 3 weeks into their partnership, Ethan discovered that everything he thought he knew about running a ranch was only half the story. The revelation came on a crisp October morning when Annie found him in the study, hunched over ledgers and contracts, trying to make sense of why their operating costs had increased 15% over the previous year, while their cattle prices had remained relatively stable. "The Henderson contract is the problem," he muttered, rubbing his temples against a developing headache. "They're paying us the same per head as last year, but demanding higher quality standards. We're spending more on feed and veterinary care, but not seeing any return on the investment." Annie studied the papers spread across the desk, her brow furrowed in concentration. Reading business documents still challenged her, but she'd been working at it every evening, determined to understand the financial side of the operation. "What if the problem isn't the cost?" she said slowly, "but what we're measuring?" "What do you mean?" "Henderson wants higher quality cattle, right? But are we giving them what they actually want, or what we think they want?" Annie moved to the window overlooking the main pasture. "Come with me, there's something you need to see." They walked together toward the grazing areas, Annie pointing out details that Ethan had never noticed, despite having walked these same paths hundreds of times. She showed him how the cattle clustered in certain areas while avoiding others, how the grass quality varied dramatically from section to section, how the natural water flow patterns affected everything from soil nutrition to disease prevention. "Your father always said that cattle know things we forget," Annie explained as they watched a small herd move methodically across a hillside. "They know which grass has the best nutrition, which water sources are cleanest, which areas provide the best shelter from weather, but we've been overriding their instincts with our convenience." Ethan followed her gaze, trying to see what she was seeing. "The rotation schedule. The rotation schedule is based on calendar dates and equal time periods, but the land doesn't work that way. Some areas recover faster than others. Some provide better nutrition at different times of year." Annie crouched down, pulling up a handful of grass and examining it carefully. "This section has been overgrazed because we kept the cattle here too long last spring. The Henderson contract requires cattle with higher fat content and better muscle development, but you can't achieve that with poor nutrition." The concept was simple, but its implications were staggering. For years, the ranch had been following a rigid system that prioritized efficiency and predictability over the natural rhythms that actually determined cattle health and quality. So how do we fix it? We start listening to the land instead of trying to force it to comply with our schedules. Annie stood, brushing dirt from her hands. It means more work in the short term, more attention to detail, more flexibility in our planning. But it also means healthier cattle, better prices, and land that improves instead of deteriorating over time. Over the following weeks, Ethan found himself accompanying Annie on daily tours of the ranch, learning to read signs he'd never noticed before. She taught him to assess grass quality by touch and sight, to identify the subtle indicators of cattle stress or contentment, to understand how weather patterns affected everything from grazing behavior to reproduction cycles. In exchange, he worked with her every evening in the study, slowly walking through the business aspects of ranch management. They reviewed contracts together, discussed negotiation strategies, analyzed market trends and pricing patterns. Annie's questions often revealed assumptions he'd never examined, forcing him to explain not just what they did, but why they did it. The cattle buyers from Denver want delivery schedules guaranteed 6 months in advance, Ethan explained one evening as they reviewed the Henderson contract renewal terms. It gives them predictability for their operations. But what if we have a drought? What if disease affects the herd? What if the cattle aren't ready when they say they'll be ready? Annie's questions had become more sophisticated as her understanding of the business grew. Then we deliver what we have and take the financial penalty for failing to meet specifications. That seems like a system designed to benefit them more than us. The observation was so obvious that Ethan wondered why he'd never questioned it before. That's how the business works. They have the buyers, we have the cattle. They set the terms. Maybe that's the problem. The conversation planted a seed that grew over the following days. As Annie's confidence in business matters increased, she began suggesting alternatives to the traditional arrangements that had governed the ranch's operations for years. What if they developed direct relationships with restaurants and specialty markets that valued quality over quantity? What if they focused on premium cattle raised with superior care rather than trying to compete in the volume market? It would mean smaller sales, at least initially, Ethan warned, more risk, more uncertainty, but also more control over our own destiny. Annie had been studying market reports and pricing trends with the same intensity she brought to reading weather patterns. And if your father was right about the way ranching is changing, maybe it's better to change with it rather than wait for it to force change on us. The first test of their new approach came when Henderson's representative arrived for the annual contract negotiation. James Harrison was a pale, thin man in an expensive suit who'd been buying cattle from the Double Eagle for 6 years. He approached negotiations with the assumption that the terms would remain essentially unchanged from previous years. The ranch would provide a specified number of cattle at predetermined times, meeting standardized quality requirements at prices set by market averages. Instead, he found himself sitting across from both Ethan and Annie, facing a completely different proposal. "We're offering a smaller number of cattle," Ethan explained, "but with quality guarantees that exceed your current specifications. Cattle raised with premium care, superior nutrition, and health standards that ensure consistent marbling and flavor profiles." Harrison's expression suggested he found the entire concept amusing. He consulted his notes. "Miss Martinez, is it? I'm sure you mean well, but cattle are cattle. The market doesn't pay premiums for sentimentality about animal care. The market pays premiums for results," Annie replied calmly. "Would you like to see the cattle we're proposing to include in this contract?" And the tour that followed, was unlike any sales presentation Harrison had experienced. Instead of simply walking through pens of cattle, Annie showed him specific animals, explaining their breeding history, nutritional management, and health records. She demonstrated the difference in muscle development and fat distribution between cattle raised under their new protocols and those raised under traditional methods. Most importantly, she could answer detailed questions about the factors that affected meat quality. Questions that most ranchers couldn't or wouldn't address because they'd never paid attention to those details. "The difference is consistency," Annie explained, as they examined a prize bull that would be included in the proposed contract. "You're not just buying cattle, you're buying a guarantee that every animal meets specific standards because we control every aspect of their care." Harrison remained skeptical, but his questions became more specific, more technical. By the end of the day, instead of rejecting their proposal outright, he was asking about delivery schedules and pricing structures. "I'll need to discuss this with my partners," he said finally. "The concept is interesting, but it would require significant changes in our own operations. Change is coming whether we prepare for it or not, Ethan said. The question is whether we want to lead it or be dragged along by it. After Harrison left, Ethan and Annie sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sun set over the vast expanse of their land. The conversation with Harrison had gone better than either of them had dared hope, but it had also made clear the magnitude of what they were attempting. "If this works," Ethan said, "it changes everything, not just for us, but for the whole approach to ranching in this territory. And if it doesn't work, then we'll have learned something valuable about the limits of innovation." Ethan glanced at Annie, struck again by how much she'd changed in just a few weeks. The quiet ranch hand had been replaced by a confident partner who asked difficult questions and challenged assumptions he'd never examined. "Your father believed it would work," Annie said. "He spent the last year of his life talking about these ideas, planning for these changes. He just didn't live long enough to implement them himself. So he left them to us. He left them to us together. Neither of us could do this alone." The simple truth of that statement settled between them like a foundation stone. Whatever their partnership had started as, necessity, confusion, mutual desperation, it was becoming something more substantial. Not friendship, exactly, and certainly not romance, but a working relationship built on complementary strengths and shared responsibility for something larger than either of their individual ambitions. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Ethan realized that for the first time since his father's death, he felt something other than loss and uncertainty about the future. There was still fear, still doubt about whether their experiment would succeed, but underneath those familiar anxieties was something new: anticipation. Marcus Caldwell's final gamble was beginning to pay dividends neither of his chosen heirs had expected. Winter arrived early that year, with October snow blanketing the ranch in a crystalline silence that made every sound carry for miles. The new approach to cattle management that had seemed so promising during the autumn negotiations faced its first serious test as temperatures dropped and the daily routines of ranch life became exercises in endurance and adaptation. Annie stood in the main barn at dawn, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air as she checked on the cattle they'd brought in from the high pastures. The premium herd, the cattle that represented their gamble on a different way of doing business, required more intensive care during the harsh weather, more attention to nutrition and health than traditional ranching methods demanded. "Morning report isn't good," Tom Brennan said as he approached, his weathered face grim with concern. "Lost 2 head overnight in the north pasture. Found them frozen near the creek. Looks like they got separated from the main herd during the storm." Annie's heart sank. Every animal lost was not just a financial blow, but a failure of the careful management system she and Ethan had been developing. Worse, the 2 cattle that had died were part of the premium herd promised to Henderson under their new contract terms. "Any sign of what separated them?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Wolves, most likely. Tracks around the area suggest a pack moved through during the night." Tom's expression conveyed years of experience with the harsh realities of ranching. The cattle scattered when they were attacked. Most made it back to the shelter areas, but those 2 got turned around in the dark. The wolf problem had been increasing throughout the territory as settlements expanded and traditional hunting grounds were disrupted. Most ranchers dealt with predator losses as an inevitable cost of doing business, but Annie and Ethan's commitment to premium cattle care made every loss more significant. "We'll need to tell Ethan," Annie said, though she dreaded the conversation. Their partnership was still fragile, built on mutual respect, but tested daily by the complexities of managing both the practical and business sides of the operation. She found him in the study, surrounded by correspondence and market reports, working by lamplight even though full daylight had arrived hours ago. The winter months meant shorter days and longer hours of administrative work, reviewing contracts, planning for spring operations, and managing the financial challenges that came with their experimental approach to ranching. "How bad?" he asked when he saw her expression. "Two head, both from the Henderson herd." Annie settled into the chair across from his desk, noting the exhaustion in his eyes. He'd been working late every night, trying to balance the books while managing the increased costs of their new methods. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, calculating the financial impact. "That puts us below the minimum delivery guarantee. Harrison will either demand a price reduction or penalty payment. Unless we can replace them from the general herd. You know that won't work. The quality standards we've promised require the specific breeding and care protocols we've been following. We can't substitute cattle that haven't been managed the same way." They sat in shared silence, both understanding the deeper implications of the loss. This was exactly the kind of setback that traditional ranching methods were designed to absorb. Large herds, standardized care, and accepted loss rates that built buffer into every transaction. Their experiment with premium quality and intensive management had no such buffers. "There's something else," Annie said reluctantly. "Tom's been talking to the other hands. They're not happy about the extra work the new methods require. Longer hours, more attention to detail, more responsibility for individual animals instead of just managing the herd as a whole." "Are they talking about leaving?" "Some of them. Jimmy Rodriguez already said he's thinking about taking a job with the Morrison Ranch come spring. Says it's too much stress keeping track of every individual animal when traditional methods work fine for everyone else." Ethan leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. The success of their experiment depended not just on the cattle and the land, but on the people who did the daily work of ranch management. If they couldn't maintain a reliable workforce, all their theories about superior ranching methods would remain just that. Theories. "What do you think?" he asked. "Are we pushing too hard, too fast?" Annie considered the question carefully. Over the past months, she'd developed confidence in her ability to assess both practical and strategic challenges, but this situation required more than technical analysis. "I think we're challenging people to care about their work in a way they've never been asked to care before," she said finally. "That's difficult and uncomfortable, but I also think the results speak for themselves. The cattle we haven't lost are healthier, stronger, and more valuable than anything the ranch has produced before. But if we can't maintain the workforce needed to implement the methods, then we need to find ways to make the work more rewarding for the people doing it." Annie had been thinking about this problem for weeks, watching the cowboys struggle with the increased demands of individualized animal care. What if we offered bonuses for the hands who work with the premium herds? What if we gave them a stake in the success of the program, instead of just asking them to work harder for the same pay? The suggestion was radical by the standards of traditional ranch management, where cowboys were paid standard wages regardless of the outcomes of their work. But it aligned with the broader philosophy that had driven their experimental approach. The idea that people, like land and animals, responded better to partnership than to exploitation. "It would mean higher operating costs," Ethan warned. "In the short term, but if it means keeping experienced hands and better results, it could pay for itself." Annie pulled out a notebook where she'd been tracking the performance of different ranch hands under the new system. Jake Morrison and Carlos Vega have been most successful with the premium cattle. Their animals have better health records, less stress indicators, higher weight gains. If we could incentivize that level of care across the entire operation. Ethan studied the notebook, impressed despite himself by the detailed records Annie had been keeping. She'd been tracking not just animal performance, but the correlation between individual cowboys' techniques and the results they achieved. It was the kind of analysis that required both practical knowledge and systematic thinking. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he observed. "Your father always said that the success of a ranch depended on every person understanding their role in the bigger picture. I've been trying to figure out how to apply that to our situation." Before Ethan could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. Tom Brennan entered, his expression even more serious than it had been that morning. "We've got company," he announced. "James Harrison from the Henderson Company, along with someone he introduced as his supervisor. They're asking to inspect the premium herd." Annie felt her stomach tighten. Harrison's early arrival could only mean one thing. He'd heard about their losses and was coming to assess whether their experimental approach was reliable enough to justify the premium contract terms. "How much do they know?" Ethan asked. "Hard to say. But they came prepared for a detailed inspection, brought their own veterinarian and quality assessment equipment." Annie and Ethan exchanged glances. This was the moment of truth for their partnership and their vision of a different approach to ranching. Everything they'd worked toward over the past months would be judged by men who understood business, but might not appreciate the complexities of the changes they were attempting to implement. "All right," Ethan said, standing and reaching for his coat. "Let's show them what we've built." As they walked toward the barns, Annie felt the weight of responsibility settle around her like the heavy winter coat she wore against the cold. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not just the future of their contract with Henderson, but the viability of the entire approach that Marcus Caldwell had entrusted to their partnership. The snow crunched under their boots as they made their way across the ranch yard, each step carrying them closer to a reckoning that would define everything that came after. The inspection took 4 hours and covered every aspect of the premium herd operation. Harrison's supervisor, a stern man named William Foster, who oversaw cattle purchasing for a consortium of Denver meatpackers, examined not just the animals themselves, but the detailed records Annie had been maintaining, the feeding protocols, the health management systems, and the innovative rotation schedules that had evolved from her understanding of land stewardship. Throughout the process, Annie found herself explaining not just what they were doing, but why they were doing it. Foster's questions were precise and challenging, designed to identify weaknesses in their approach or inconsistencies in their methods. Traditional ranching accepts a certain percentage of loss as inevitable, Foster observed as they stood in the main barn surrounded by the premium cattle. Your approach appears to require significantly more investment per animal, with the assumption that you can achieve near zero loss rates. What happens when that assumption proves incorrect, as it did with yesterday's wolf attack? "We accept that no system is perfect," Ethan replied carefully, "but we also believe that higher investment per animal, combined with more intensive care, produces better results overall than traditional methods. Even when external factors, predators, weather, disease, affect individual animals regardless of the care they receive." Annie stepped forward, recognizing that this was the crucial moment. Foster wasn't just evaluating their cattle, he was assessing whether their entire philosophy could survive the inevitable challenges of real-world ranching. "Mr. Foster, could I show you something specific?" she asked, leading him toward a section of the barn where several of the premium cattle were housed. These animals were exposed to the same storm conditions that killed the 2 we lost yesterday. Same weather, same predator pressure, same external challenges. She opened the gate to one of the stalls, allowing Foster to examine a young bull that represented the best of their breeding and care program. The animal was calm, well-muscled, and showed none of the stress indicators common in cattle that had survived traumatic weather. "The difference isn't that we can prevent all losses," Annie continued. "The difference is that the animals we don't lose are significantly healthier and more valuable than cattle raised under traditional methods. Yesterday we lost 2 animals, but saved 23. Under traditional management, we might have saved all 25, but they would have been worth less per head and shown more stress-related health problems." Foster examined the bull carefully, noting the muscle development, fat distribution, and general condition. His questions became more technical, focusing on the specific care protocols that had produced these results. "Your records indicate that feed costs per animal are 30% higher than industry standards," he noted. "But weight gain and meat quality are 45% above average," Ethan added. The math favors our approach, even accounting for higher operating costs. In good times, perhaps, but ranching isn't just about good times. It's about surviving droughts, disease outbreaks, market crashes, and other challenges that can destroy operations that don't have sufficient reserves. Annie exchanged glances with Ethan. This was the heart of their disagreement with traditional ranching philosophy, whether it was better to prepare for failure or to invest in success. "Mr. Foster," she said quietly, "could I tell you something my father taught me about this land?" Foster raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting personal philosophy from a cattle inspection. He said that the desert teaches you two approaches to survival. You can spread yourself thin, conserve everything, and hope you have enough reserves to last through the bad times. Or you can find the places where water runs deep, invest everything in those places, and build something strong enough to weather any storm. Annie gestured toward the cattle around them. Your approach assumes that bad times are inevitable, and the best you can do is minimize damage. Our approach assumes that if you build something strong enough, you can turn challenges into opportunities. And if you're wrong, then we failed spectacularly instead of slowly declining over decades. Annie's answer was direct and honest. But if we're right, we build something that lasts for generations. Foster was quiet for a long moment, studying not just the cattle, but the two people who created this operation. Finally, he turned to Harrison. "I want to see the financial projections and market analysis for this approach. If the numbers support the claims they're making, this could be exactly what we need to differentiate our products in the Denver market." The conversation that followed moved from the barn to the study, where Ethan presented the business case for premium cattle operations with the confidence that came from months of detailed analysis. But it was Annie's presence, her quiet authority about the practical aspects of animal care and land management, that convinced Foster they weren't just proposing a business strategy, but demonstrating a sustainable approach to ranching. By late afternoon, instead of cancelling their contract due to the losses from the wolf attack, Foster was discussing expansion of the premium program and the possibility of exclusive arrangements that would give the Double Eagle Ranch preferred status with his consortium of buyers. "There are risks," he cautioned as they concluded their negotiations. "Market fluctuations, consumer preferences, competition from other regions, but the quality you're producing could command premium prices that justify those risks." After Foster and Harrison departed, Annie and Ethan found themselves alone in the study as evening shadows lengthened across the ranch. The day had been a success beyond their hopes, but both were too exhausted to feel anything approaching celebration. "I keep thinking about what my father would say if he could see what we've accomplished," Ethan said finally. "I think he'd say we're just getting started." Annie was looking through the window toward the pastures where their cattle grazed under the vast Wyoming sky. "Everything we've done so far has been preparation. The real work begins now." Ethan followed her gaze, seeing the ranch with different eyes than he'd had 6 months ago. The land that had once seemed like his birthright now felt like a responsibility he was still learning to carry. The partnership that had begun in confusion and resentment had evolved into something stronger than either of them could have created alone. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, "about the will, about my father's decision." Annie turned to look at him, her expression carefully neutral. "I was angry for a long time, felt betrayed, cheated out of what I thought was mine by right." Ethan's voice carried the weight of hard-won understanding. "But I realize now that he wasn't taking anything away from me. He was giving me something I couldn't have earned on my own." "What's that?" "The chance to be worthy of this place." Ethan gestured toward the ranch around them. "If he'd just left everything to me, I would have managed it competently, probably successfully. But I never would have learned what you've taught me about really listening to the land, really caring for the animals, really understanding what it means to be a steward instead of just an owner." Annie was quiet for a moment. And I never would have learned what you've taught me about turning good intentions into sustainable business practices. Your father didn't choose between us. He chose both of us because he knew we needed each other. As the last light faded from the sky, they sat in comfortable silence, two people who discovered that the most important inheritance wasn't land or money or even knowledge, but the wisdom to recognize when your own understanding wasn't enough, and the courage to build something new with someone whose strengths complemented your weaknesses. Outside, the Double Eagle Ranch settled into the rhythms of another night, its cattle safe in the barns and pastures, its land resting under the protection of two people who'd learned to see it not as property to be managed, but as a living system to be nurtured. In the morning, there would be new challenges, new decisions, new tests of the partnership that had grown from necessity into something approaching friendship. But tonight, for the first time since Marcus Caldwell's death, the future felt not like a burden to be carried, but like a promise to be fulfilled. The ranch hand and the rancher's son had become something their individual dreams had never imagined. Partners in the truest sense, bound together by shared responsibility for something larger and more enduring than either of their separate ambitions. And in that partnership, Marcus Caldwell's final gamble had achieved something more valuable than any traditional inheritance could have provided. The foundation for a legacy that would honor the past while building toward a future worthy of the land they'd learned to love. As Annie walked to her cabin and Ethan climbed the stairs to his father's room, his room now, both carried with them the quiet satisfaction of people who'd discovered that the most important lessons often come disguised as the challenges we think we can't survive. The Double Eagle Ranch would face more tests in the years to come, but it would face them with the strength that comes from authentic partnership and the wisdom that grows when people learn to combine their individual gifts in service of something greater than themselves. Marcus Caldwell's legacy was secure, not because he'd left his ranch to the right person, but because he'd created the conditions for the right people to find each other and build something together that neither could have achieved alone.